Did everyone get my email I sent? Let's see. Henry's here. All right. So that's close enough. Remember, I sent an email saying that there will be, bless you, your evaluations of the class. We'll do that second half. Professor Bobro will come in, observe the class. He's got class now. He's going to break it up. He's going to come to this class. I think around, I don't know what time, 10-ish, 10:15. Then I have to stop about 5-7 minutes before we're let out so that you can do your online evaluation of me. So I sent an email saying make sure you have your phones or whatever, which was painful for me to send that out. Please make sure you do so. If you don't have it, I think you have time to do that online. Like 24 hours or 2 days. I'm not sure what the deal is. Let me get back your work from last time. I'm going to get into the chapter that you had for today, chapter 11, which was critical thinking and morality in the law. I'm going to start with legal reasoning first, then build back to the very case that you guys wrote about in your work, group work last time. Let me get these back to you. Sarah and Alicia, Connor and Ashley.
Yeah.
Just hold on to it. If your partner's not here, just keep it, bring it next time. Natalie, Jesse, Mari, and Nell. You're the only one of that group. Domenica and Gabriella, Finn and Marley, Anand and Henry and Nicholas. That was this group here. Sarah, Ruth, and Kieran. Strong paper. And Nicole and Alex. And Ignacio and Brandon. Not here. Okay. So, hold off on that, looking over. Make sure the grade I wrote on there is the same that you have online. And I'm going to actually go over that in class in a little bit once I catch up to where I want to discuss this. In particular, when we look back at moral arguments with respect to our discussion for today and analogical reasoning. So, last time we reviewed what an argument by analogy was, and in the simplest description of it, you have something that we know about A, and B is the case in question. We don't know something about that. We want to know whether or not the number of similarities between these two instances, whether they're cases, whether they're situations, states of affairs, moral situations, we want to say that both of them have this in common. You could be really simple and innocuous with the example of, well, we want to know whether this is a car, let's say, gets good gas mileage. Where's the laser? So, for instance, 5 happens to be our feature in question. Good gas mileage. We want to know whether or not the number of similarities and the relevance of the similarities leads to the likelihood of that final conclusion. And it's really easy to do this with things that don't take a whole lot of emotional toll on us. Non-moral issues, for example, or non-legal issues, it's pretty easy to say the size of the car is a relevant similarity. If they're analogous in that way, that's going to be relevant to whether or not this car in question is going to get good gas mileage. This is the most common form of reasoning in general, I think. There's debates about whether or not causal arguments are more common. I'm not really going to concern myself with that. Just know that you use analogical reasoning all the time. And it's especially useful in moral and legal arguments. You can think of it in terms of cases. This is the case that we're concerned with today, let's say. Whether or not it's an instance of free speech, like you guys had to do with your second papers. That was a relevant factor in many of your papers, at least. Here's the case at issue, whether or not we have an instance of freedom of speech and we should allow this person to continue saying whatever it is that they're saying. What the defense attorney is going to do is appeal to what's known, what do attorneys appeal to? What are prior cases called? You know that word in law? It's just the...
Prejudice?
Not prejudice, but...
Something like that.
That's right. But, well, sounds similar, but not at all
Yeah.
the same thing. Precedent. Preceding cases. And so what we're dealing with legal reasoning, and I'm not going to get into the details of this, I'm just going to actually get into examples, because there's a whole lot to say about the basics of legal reasoning. But in general, the things that we're looking at is, well, what laws should we have, and how are they decided? Once we figured that out, how do we then interpret those laws and apply them? And what we look for in so many cases is what has already been settled. Sometimes it's referred to stare decisis, or you ought not change settled decisions. A more explicit way, a more detailed and precise way of putting it is, we shouldn't change settled decisions unless we have really good reason to. It's sort of similar to the virtues of beliefs that we saw. We want to be conservative in our decisions. We're going to be conservative in the sense that we don't just upend previous case law. So with respect to freedom of speech, that's something that you can find relevant in multiple court cases. So the assignment you had for last time had to do with looking at a comparison. I'll look at this in a little bit, but a comparison between a moral argument from Peter Singer and a particular case in which it seemed obvious what the answer was. And there's a similar kind of thinking here. We know in this case, in this previous court case, the defendant won the case in favor of freedom of speech. And we say this current case, I'm the defense attorney, let's say, is relevantly similar to this previous case in which the defendant won the case. Both involve the freedom of speech. Both involve freedom of speech over the internet, let's say, in saying things through a blog post or something like that. Would it be a relevant difference if one case was on the internet and the other case wasn't? Perhaps it would. In fact, that's the goal, that's the point of some prosecutorial cases, where they'll say, yes, this person bullied this individual. But to what extent is bullying online, let's say that's the current case, analogous to prior cases of bullying in person? And with the rise of the internet, with the rise of technology, oftentimes our moral sense is slower. It's behind, so to speak. The technology advances too quickly for us to actually take account for it. And so you have something called cyberbullying. Have you heard of this? That's a new concept. And why does it come about? Well, because people get bullied online. And there are horrible, horrible cases of children committing suicide because of the cyberbullying. And there was never any law in place to address that. If you could find that this individual was bullying, and it turns out in some cases it was a parent of one of the children who's bullying this other child because they don't want their kid next to their kid or something like that, and continually pretends to be that other child and says horrible things about this other person. Just awful. And it ends up leading to the child's, and here you get into causal arguments as well. To what extent did the cyberbullying have a causal connection to the child actually ending their lives? What current case do we appeal to say, this is similar to those cases and this is how they ruled in those cases? And each time you're utilizing the basic principles of argument by analogy. How many similarities are there? Are the similarities relevant? Is one case of cyberbullying relevantly dissimilar or disanalogous to bullying that happens face-to-face? Is that a relevant dissimilarity? What is the degree of similarity or dissimilarity? How many primary analogs are there? In court cases, a primary analog is the case that you're using as representative of and similar to the case in question. Here's the case that we're trying now. How many other cases are there that are similar to this one and were decided, in this case, in favor of the defendant? The more primary analogs you have, the stronger your case. The more cars that you have that have these similarities to the target case, the greater likely the conclusion is going to follow. That this car could be espionage, or that this defendant ought to be treated in this case similarly. Similar cases
must be decided similarly. The other principles were the diversity among the primary analogs. That's unclear what that means on the face of it. With respect to cars, the diversity among the analogs might be you've got multiple drivers. Again, the feature in question is whether or not that car gets good gas mileage. That make and model of the car gets good gas mileage. So I want to buy a car that gets good gas mileage, so I'm going to look at other make and models that are similar to that. And if multiple people drive that same make and model, and for each of them who drive differently, they all still get good gas mileage, that further strengthens your case. That's a diversity among the primary analogs. With court cases, we might say something like, the Supreme Court ruled in this particular case that it was an analog to the current one. The appellate courts ruled in the same way. The circuit courts ruled in the same way, and so on. Those are primary analogs, and the more diverse they are, the broader they are, the stronger your case that issue in question should follow in the current case. So that's typically how it's done in law. It's the most common form of reasoning with respect to law. There's a last principle I didn't talk about. It's not obviously relevant in each of these cases, but the specificity of the conclusion. So again, the principles of evaluating analogical arguments, which I'll post them up. Actually, that's these right here. Why is it so blurry? That's weird. Is it me or is that blurry? That's blurry.
I think it might be just you.
Could be. It could be the heroin. No, it's not the heroin. Just kidding. It is the heroin. Don't do drugs, everyone. So the number of similarities, the relevance of the similarities, we already talked about these, the nature and degree of dissimilarities. How similar are these court cases? If I'm a prosecutor, I'm going to say, no, your appeal to these precedents is flawed because they're not properly analogous. Yes, in these cases, the jury or the judge ruled in favor of the defendant, but there's a relevant dissimilarity. In fact, that's a phrase you want to get down, because that's the most common element of moral reasoning with respect to analogy. What are the morally relevant differences? Each word is important. If there are no morally relevant differences, then the two cases in question, or if there are multiple cases, ought to be dealt with similarly. That goes back to, of course, the court case, the court notion. Similar cases should be decided similarly because you're appealing to preceding or precedent cases, preceding cases. And you ought not change settled decisions to the extent that they're well decided. Not necessarily. Roe v. Wade is a settled decision with respect to abortion, but some argue that it should be overturned. Brown versus Board of Education, settled decision, but that overturned a law before it, settled case, Plessy versus Ferguson, with respect to separate but equal situations with respect to race and education. Tessie, yes?
So I thought in my paper that I mentioned morally relevant differences, but you said that it didn't show weakness in his argument. But I thought it was, because I didn't think that these, in the homework, I didn't think that the two were
Okay.
similar.
I'll get to that, and after class I can look at it as well. But I'll get to, in fact, that very argument in a moment. But I may have made a mistake. I'll look it over again. So the nature and degree of disanalogy, talked about that. How many analogs are there? You may only have one. It doesn't mean your argument's no good. The more the better. And the diversity we talked about. Specificity of conclusion is simply to say the more specific, the more narrow the conclusion, the more exact it is insofar as you're comparing it to the primary analogs. In the primary court case that I'm appealing to, they decided this way. And therefore you should decide exactly in the same way. That's a very specific conclusion. And it's easier to refute. The more specific your conclusion, that is, the less vague it is, the easier it is to refute. That doesn't mean it's a weaker argument. In fact, when we get to scientific reasoning, you're going to want very specific conclusions. The better scientific hypothesis is one that it is easier to come up with a refutation for. And to the extent that it doesn't get refuted, that strengthens the case. If I'm going to say that car A gets good gas mileage, in fact it gets 48.3 miles to the gallon, that's very specific. And I argue, well, given the similarities between those two cars, this car, the target that I want to buy, will get 48.3, whatever I said a moment ago, miles per gallon. Bless you. That's very easy to refute. All you have to say is, well, it only got 47 miles per gallon. Well, then you're incorrect. But still, it's a stronger argument to make in the sense that it's more detailed, more specific, and we'll see with scientific reasoning why that's a benefit. Just a basic point about arguments by analogy. You can be vague and thereby making it harder to refute. It'll get good gas mileage. But you also then ultimately say less, right? We'll see why that's potentially problematic. Okay, so let's look at a case. Case A. You downloaded music online, you didn't pay for it. Let's imagine somebody does this. This very strange behavior. Is this, or the claim is, this is analogous to case B, where you took, or someone took a CD. Remember CDs? CDs were these compact discs, which were spherical silver things that, do you know? Okay, you know what they are. They got caught now in jail. What do we conclude from this? What would be the argument to expand on this? How is stealing from a brick and mortar store analogous or disanalogous to downloading music without paying for it? Yep.
I suppose more walls are broken down, literally, when you're stealing from a brick and mortar store, like you could be charged for breaking them.
Let's say that you're in there and you're just putting it in your pocket. You're just browsing. And then he's putting it in your pocket. No, I don't want anything. I thought I did, but I don't. Then you leave. Somebody you took the magnetic thing off, so you're really good at that. I don't know.
You're pro.
Yeah, you're a pro at it. But you're also, by analogy, you can find any song you want online and just download it to your computer. And maybe give it to your friends, too. Because with the CD, you can make a copy of it and give it to your friends. There's another person who's not buying that CD now. What's the morally relevant difference between those cases? What's the legally relevant difference? Yeah?
One is actual physical robbery, whereas
Yep.
the other one is more intellectual property, I guess.
And are those relevant differences with respect to the moral or legal? Perhaps with punishments?
Yeah.
Because, in fact, how many have downloaded music? Stolen from a store. Ha! How many have downloaded music without paying for it?
I did it and I got a virus on my computer and I haven't done it since, to be quite honest. I Spotify.
That's
It's okay.
hilarious. That's not hilarious.
No,
That's
I'm
unfortunate.
terrible with technology. I don't download.
Some might call that instant karma.
Every time I've downloaded anything, I always
Yeah.
get something. I even
So you
when I go to the websites that people tell me about, it's like I don't even know anymore. I don't watch movies online. It's not worth my time.
I understand. Well, don't use the computers here then.
It's okay.
So interesting. But most of us have, and so probably when you did it, did you think, I'm not helping out these artists. I'm actually taking their products and not paying for it, and I'm enjoying it. And how are they surviving? Don't they survive by selling their products? And if it's all available for free online, aren't I stealing from them?
I think in that way, like the incentive could be a little spiteful, like, oh, I don't really like this artist, but I do want to hear this album, so I'm going to download it legally.
But you wouldn't do that for artists you love.
I suppose if you were thinking about supporting the artist, you'd consider paying for it, but knowing that you can download it for legally, it's just
Is it illegal, first of all? Sometimes it says it is. Other times it's unclear.
I guess if it's like formally produced and like released and on platforms like Apple Music and what have you.
But it's-
otherwise you can download a lot of music from Bandcamp.
Yeah.
Stream it.
One time at Bandcamp, I did that. Yes.
I think another difference is that when you take a CD from a store, you're not only taking from the artist, but you're also taking the profit that the store would have made. And I feel like if you get it online, for them it's good because you get to visit their website and they can give you an ad or whatever and make money that way. So they want you.
But does Bandcamp get you to their site, or is it just a list?
Bandcamp's free. Depends on who the artist
Because there's other things like LimeWire, these older venues, and what was the big one that Metallica was arguing against? Napster, right. That was where it all began. And it was Metallica who said, we don't like this because we're losing out. But strangely, other bands who were unknown were like, we don't mind it. It gets our music out there. There's a bit of a tension there, right? Go ahead.
It's also kind of like how much it costs to make a CD and the case for the CD, and how like a song online is just streamed to your computer like this.
That's right. But you also can stream to your computer the same music and pay for it. Why is it acceptable to stream it to your computer and not pay for it? Simply because it's not physical. Why is it goes back to your original point. That is a difference. The question is it a legal and or moral difference?
Could you just like solve this argument by just like there's the new category of like the internet, so it's like it has its own legal rules, and it's just like
In many ways that's the case. And that gets into moral dilemmas. Can we come up with laws that are divorced from morality? And some argue that no, in fact, all all legality is grounded in morality. We'll see that comes apart, and why that comes apart. But it seems there's points at which there just aren't preceding cases that are analogous that we can just appeal to and say, well, here's how we did it in convicting criminals who stole from stores. But online is different. Go back to the cyberbullying. We need to come up with new approaches, new ways of thinking. And then therefore we have to be somewhat creative and come up with new laws. And what do we ground those new laws in if there's not preceding cases? And you might say there's nothing new under the sun. There's always going to be something parallel or analogous to. But to your point, maybe not sufficiently so to make the case. So that's something I'm going to come back to in a few minutes when we look at how laws are what we use to ground our moral laws. Here's another case. And here I'm going to give you an argument by analogy with respect to a comparison between two cases. Did you have a question?
Yeah, wait, can you just sum up what the moral the differences are, or like what's
So the point is this is just
Yeah.
the point of this is just to get us to prime our intuitions about moral reasoning and legal reasoning with respect to arguments by analogy. If I want to argue that your downloading music without paying for it is analogous to stealing, I have to make appeals to precedent, or what is most common, appeal to actions that we know are wrong. We know it is wrong to steal from a store, to take a CD without paying for it. If I think that downloading music without paying is wrong too, then the most obvious way of making that case is to say, stealing, I can't say stealing music online because that begs the question. That's the whole point at issue. But downloading music and not paying for it is analogous to stealing from a store in these ways. And the extent that they're analogous in these ways, and there are other cases we can point to that are analogous, increase the number of analogs and the number of relevant similarities, we ought to reason similarly. Given the parallels and similarities, it ought to be seen as equally wrong, or at least somewhat similarly wrong, to stealing from a store. That's how. Now, I didn't go through all that argument. There's a lot more details we would need to know, but that's how that might go. And it's a very common form of reasoning. We'll see that that's what Peter Singer uses in his paper, The Obligation to Assist. A variation of this, imagine an argument that goes like this. Premise 1, guns don't kill people. People kill people. You ever heard that? You've heard that. Premise 2, making a gun safer is impossible. Guns are by nature dangerous. Premise 3, the goal, or a goal, should be to teach people gun safety, or something like that. And you can variations on this premise. Only a good guy with a gun can stop a bad guy with a gun. That's a phrase we've heard from the Wayne LaPierre of the NRA. More safety regulations on guns is ineffective. The ultimate conclusion, no more gun regulations. That's an argument having to do with moral and legal issues. Now, there's a counter-argument that we would use by analogy, or to show that this argument potentially fails to the extent that it follows the same kind of reasoning as the following argument, which we presume fails. And I'll return to this if you'd like. And I'll post these slides for you. Consider the second case, case B. Cars don't kill people, people kill people. Making a car safer is impossible. This is actually an argument that the car industry in the 1950s and 60s actually made, vehemently made, fought vehemently, that's how much they fought against it, because they used the word vehemently twice, against car safety measures. The goal should be to teach people how to drive more safely, drive defensively. Only a good guy, I don't know, I tried to make that a parallel, I couldn't. I don't think that really works. Only a good guy in a car can stop a bad guy in a car? No, that doesn't quite work. More safety regulations on cars is ineffective. No more car regulations. There's a history of this and a detail of that case with that webpage there. Is this analogous to the first argument? And if so, does the first argument fail because this one fails? And by the way, this fails. Ralph Nader very famously showed, hey, you should have seatbelts in cars. And the car industry thought, oh, that's too expensive. We're not doing that. That's not going to save people's lives anyway. And eventually, that was demonstrated that, yeah, they do save lives. And you can change the way that cars were made. Think about what it was like. They were just metal boxes. And they would just collapse. And you get into an accident, and you had no seatbelt. You're flying through windshields. The number of people dying in car accidents, the greatest cause of death in the 1950s and 60s, one of the greatest causes, was car accidents. And that's after the first automobile death, which was only some 50, or let's see, what would have been 1940s, some 20, 30 years prior to that. And that immediately, so quickly became such a leading cause.
Doesn't this argument kind of fail because the counter argument, you just kind of switch like the word car and the word people around, or gun and people, like the same way? It's just like the argument is the same on both sides.
Correct.
On what to regulate, so it's like you're not really like making any ground on each side.
Oh, I think. Well, that's true, but the point of the argument by analogy is to show, bless you, that this argument fails. And if this argument fails, and here's the part of the analogy, this is where the work has to happen. And since this argument is properly analogous to this argument should fail too. But that case has to be made. Why is this argument analogous to this? And maybe they're disanalogies. And so let's say I am an advocate for the NRA. I'm going to say something like, wait a minute, no, this is not the same thing. There's a relevant difference here. Yeah, that argument fails, and we see why. We see the evidence of regulation of car safety and the decrease in deaths. It's even though there's like 25,000 people dying every year of car accidents, that number has been decreased exponentially because of car safety, airbags and seatbelts and so on. Go ahead.
Oh, I know.
Okay. So our argument would have to be these two cases are analogous. How are they disanalogous? In the morally relevant or legally relevant ways. That's what we'd have to do to counter this argument by analogy. Yeah.
Purpose of the two objects
The point of a car is not to defend yourself or kill others. The point of a gun is to defend yourself or kill others, or for fun. I guess there is a similarity there. I like to drive. I like to shoot. I like to go to the driving range. Wait, is there a driving range? Wait, that's golf. I like to go to the racetrack, and I like to go to the shooting range. So there's a parallel. But you're right. Is that a relevant difference? That case there would be a case, an inroad for saying, I see what you're saying, this argument fails. And that's what you do with arguments by analogy. You start with a case that's obvious to us. Yeah, crappy argument, that's not going to work. Of course we regulate the safety of automobiles. Of course we do. Then the job is showing how this obvious case is analogous to the less obvious one, which in this case is the guns. And in response, if we say, no, I think we ought not regulate more guns for these reasons. First of all, this argument is different than that one, and you can maybe expand on why the purpose of the object in question is relevant. And maybe it is. But that would take a bit more work, I think. There's another hand over here, I thought. Yeah.
Can you define analogous?
Analogous is to simply, that means they're analogs or similar. So analogous is just like argument by analogy. These two cases are similar to each other in these ways, therefore there are probably further similarities. Case A is an obvious instance of immorality, for example. And case A is analogous to or similar to case B, which is the case that we're currently thinking about. Are they properly analogous? If so, then we ought to treat them similarly. If case A, which is similar to B, is immoral, then B ought to be seen as immoral too, to the extent that they're properly analogous. Some people say analogous. I don't think that's right, but it's fine. Analogous, whatever. Questions on this? Any other comments on it? Yeah.
But these like arguments aren't analogous, right? Is that what you're trying to
No. The argument, at least from this site, is trying to say they are properly analogous. And because they're properly analogous, and this argument fails, so too should this one. Yeah, make sure that's clear. And if we think this argument actually is good, we have to say why it's why it is disanalogous to the other case. And I think we can start doing that by saying, well, what's the purpose of a car? Is it different than the purpose of a gun? And is that then a morally relevant or legally relevant difference? Yeah.
Let's say we're doing something on the Second Amendment, whether it's, in standard logical form, should we mention, if we're going to use an argument by analogy, should we mention that in SLF, or do we?
Mention what?
The analogy.
Oh, yes. In fact, that's what this is.
Should that be the?
I'm not sure. You should do this. You should do it like this. This is standard logical form. Let's say you disagree with this argument. You want to present it in its strongest light possible. And I don't know that I've done that here. Maybe we could expand on that. So you do that, and then you say, wait a minute, this is similar to this. And this is a bad argument, therefore the first one's a bad argument.
So would you state both of these?
You would have them both. The best option is to clearly, and if you can get them synoptically, next to each other, in columns, which I thought I could do, and there's too many words, then you can see, oh, wait a minute, they are analogous, right, in these ways. And then the discussion begins. And here's how it goes. Burden of proof shifts. No, I don't think they're analogous in the appropriate way. Here's why. And then you respond, no, your counter is to say they're dissimilar, but they're not dissimilar in a morally relevant way. You're like, to say that these are dissimilar, here might be the response to your comment about the purpose. That's like saying this car gets good gas mileage and it has leather interior, and so does this car, therefore they're similar. Well, they may be similar in that they both have leather interior, but what role does the leather interior play? Right? You see how that discussion would go. And then your response would be, well, of course, but that's a weak analogy because purpose is different than the leather seats in that case.
Isn't this just like one step away from a straw man? Or like fallacy quickly can become one?
Only if that's why the job of showing that this is similar. It has to be done.
But
it would be a straw man if I made this argument weak. And that's why it's unclear that I've made that the strongest case for the gun for this particular position. The straw man would happen here, not in the analogy. The analogy is saying this is similar enough to that previous case, to the previous argument. And since this argument fails, so does that other one. One response to this is to say, well, wait a minute, you're right. The way you've written these two arguments, they are very similar. But nobody actually reasonably reasons this way. And therefore, you're misrepresenting the actual argument. Right? And there would be the straw man. Not with the comparison. And maybe that is a straw man. But I think that's pretty close to some of the arguments, at least. All right, questions on that? Let's continue on here. I want to get to the Peter Singer article. But the first thing I want to say before I get to that, connect what it is about legal reasoning that seems to imply some moral consideration. And we kind of already touched on this, because there are cases in which we just don't have legal precedent. And so we kind of have to be inventive. Here's what we think and why we think. This should be a law. You probably said that to yourself. They should have a law about that. Usually it's when something bad happens to you and you think, well, that should be illegal. Like somebody cuts you off in a pickup truck, that shit should be illegal. And then you're getting into questions of, well, what is it that grounds our laws? What is it that says this is the law and it should be the law? It isn't the law because somebody says it is. That's not enough. There's got to be a good reason for it. And so we're not going into how laws are made. I'm not doing that. There's a song about that. Just go download that song for free and find out how laws are made. Or steal it from a store, whatever. Same thing. So we might ask, how do we come up with these laws? One common sense view, on the face of it, prima facie, is legal moralism. On the face of it, it seems right that we enact laws, we develop laws, we have laws that prohibit immoral action or that allow moral action. If something is deemed immoral, well, then there should be a law against it. And that's a pretty straightforward, commonsensical view. But very quickly, as the text references this concept, this term, counterexamples come up. Counterexamples, thought experiments, which we've done before, where you try to imagine if that's what it is. Here are examples in which we find something that is immoral and yet it's legal. That's a counterexample. Or find something that's legal. No, find something that's illegal but not immoral. And once you've found those counterexamples to this principle, that shows that it weakens that view. That indeed there's a delamination of law and ethics. It isn't the case that all laws are based in ethics, and it isn't the case that there's a tight overlapping of the two. Do you have any counterexamples?
Just historically, or
Anything that would show, you know what, there's a, or even currently, it's against the law to do this, but is it immoral to have done that?
Like getting rich,
Speeding, getting rich?
gay marriage,
Oh, gay marriage. Getting rich.
like that was illegal.
It was illegal, right? Was it immoral? Is the reason it was illegal to allow same-sex marriage because it was immoral? That's actually one argument. People do argue that you ought not allow gay marriage because it's immoral. But then, of course, why is it immoral? Well, now you need to invoke a moral principle. What general moral principle would have to be advocated? Well, gay marriage is wrong because... You could say that, but we'd have to say then further why my religion is saying it. Because then we get into questions of...
Why is your religion going to be the universal law?
That's what we want to get to. What would be a moral principle that's general? It's tough to come up with them sometimes.
In certain cities, you can't build buildings past a certain height.
Like Santa Barbara.
Yeah.
Why?
Because there's an airport.
And no, it's because of the view.
It could be the view,
It's because
the
like
people
if
around
you
you.
build like a house, if you're like below them, and you build a house above them.
Then the next person's got to build higher, and then you got skyscrapers eventually. In Chicago, you're not allowed to... What is this? I may be confusing two together, but you're not allowed to sell alcohol to dogs. And you can't continue selling alcohol in your establishment if it's on fire. These are laws on the books. Just because they haven't gotten rid of them yet, I think is part of the reason. Oh, in Alabama, Mobile, Alabama, you're not allowed to go outside after night, after dark, unless your slave is in front of your carriage with a candlelight, with a canter, with a, what's that thing called?
There's like one
Lantern. That law is probably not enforced anymore. It's just interesting, yeah.
Wait, what was the law with the dogs in the house?
You're not, I can't remember. Look that one up. In Chicago, because there's a huge fire at one point, I don't know what the dogs and maybe it's other kind of
I
animal.
can't even buy alcohol. Why would a dog be able to?
Yeah, exactly.
That's not fair.
How dare you feed that dog alcohol? And then the other thing was something about if the building's on fire, you can't continue to serve alcohol. Apparently, people really wanted their drinks when the building was on fire. It's on fire, I need a drink, man. Anyway, it seems these are not morally connected. Seatbelt, helmets. When I lived in Illinois, you didn't have to wear a helmet. It was not, when I first got there, people were flying past me on their motorcycles with no helmets. How is that possible? But it's not a law. Not a law there.
You don't have to wear helmets in the law.
Yeah, but there's another case of it, yeah.
Isn't it not a lot, like you don't have to wear a helmet if you're over 18?
In California?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I think you
In
have,
California, you have to wear a helmet at all times.
I think you have to, well, unless you're in
Well,
class.
on a motorcycle.
Are you a motorcycle rider? Where's your helmet? You're right. 1 year, I think in California you have to wear a helmet at all on the motorcycle.
But yeah, like I'm from Minnesota, and same thing. You don't have to wear a helmet. If you're over 18. But if you're under 18 in Minnesota, then you have to wear a helmet.
Ah, interesting. But what's the moral relevance to that? You have to wear a seatbelt when driving a car. It's against the law not to. Is there a moral case there? Maybe, but it would take a little bit of work to demonstrate that. Many argue that abortion is immoral, but at certain stages of development, it's not illegal. You see the distinction between morality and legality. Cheating on your spouse, infidelity, not illegal, technically. Many would argue it's immoral, and there are many, many other cases. So legal moralism makes a lot of sense, but it has its limitations. The harm principle, this one comes up as well. No, there are laws against driving barefoot. Did you know that? I think in California too. It's a weird one. I think you have to have shoes. How the officer would find that out, and you're sticking your foot out the window, I guess. What harm is there in driving barefoot? It's not obvious that all laws are based on do no harm. And what kind of harm? This comes up in your reading from today on page 251 as well, where we look at agreement among in moral discourse. There's not even agreement on legal discourse. We find that what is the extent of harm? This came up again in your second papers. To what extent is somebody being harmed by allowing this behavior? Does allowing same-sex marriage harm people? That was an argument. They tried to make that it harms individuals. Who is it harming? Well, the consenting adults can't make that case. Potentially children, you might be able to make that case. But how that is borne out is difficult. So the common sense notion of following this harm principle, even though that seems obvious, have laws against doing something that harms other people, you have to ask what kind of harm it is. Because are all harms illegal or immoral? Can you come up with a counterexample to that, where harming somebody, in fact, is necessary?
I mean, not necessarily necessary, but anything that we do as far as driving goes pollutes and harms the general or the public goods of air quality. It's not illegal to drive.
It's not illegal to drive. We know there's going to be accidents. In fact, in the previous class, we just looked at the number of people killed by car accidents. It's amazing how dangerous it is, and we still do it because the joys and pleasures in getting where we want to go quickly outweighs the potential harm. It would be more harmful, I guess, if you want to put it in the text. We'll talk about utilitarianism or consequentialist grounds. It would be greater harm to preclude people from driving in that case.
Aren't there legal requirements to what your car is emitting?
Currently there are, and in California there are pretty high standards. The current administration may change that. The guy who's in charge of the EPA has considered changing that. Scott Pruitt is his name. He's interested in making things a little different with respect to that, which may benefit us in the end. All right, leave that open. Another view that presumably grounds our legal claims and our laws themselves is to assume a kind of legal paternalism, and this I don't know that many in the United States will find positive. Although we can see why it might be the case. We enact laws that prohibit people from doing harm to themselves. The state or government acts kind of as a parent in this case. They know better. They know best. And there was a couple of years ago in New York, the governor, I've forgotten his name. I can see him now. Who was the governor of New York? Who made, not Giuliani, after him. He made the law. Yes, Bloomberg. Yeah, Bloomberg. I believe that's who it was. I think he was the governor, where under his tutelage or under his power, there was a law against selling sodas of a certain size. Do you recall that? Like the 60 ounces that you're not allowed to sell those at convenience stores. And why would that be the case? Why would anyone consider that as a law? How dare you tell me what I can and cannot drink? Who are you to say that it's bad for me to drink 60 ounces of sugar water? Well, you should be able to figure that on your own, I guess, right? That's like legal paternalism, though it makes sense. You shouldn't drink soda at all, ever. It's terrible. But if you want to, that should be left up to you. That's the buyer beware thing. So this seems to be problematic, and you see other connections to it with the seatbelt laws or helmet laws. Who are you to say that I should behave in this way, or I should drive in this fashion, or smoke. But notice, once you involve other people, you don't get to say. I'm only smoking and only harming myself. Well, that's not necessarily true. Go back to our causal arguments before. I mean, in fact, on campus, you can't smoke anywhere on campus, correct? Why is that? Is the schools looking out for your health? Yes, but also you can't smoke anywhere on campus. Wait, what? Really? I didn't know that. What's going on there? I knew you couldn't do heroin anywhere, but I'm just kidding. You can't smoke in your car? But you can't be with the windows up. Yeah, well, that makes sense.
Like your backyard's okay, but any kind of public.
I didn't know that. That's terrible if you're a smoker, but awesome if you're not, I guess. So there's a law that it seems to infringe. Is it infringing on people's rights? Is it wrong to do that? To say you can't smoke out here?
It's secondhand smoke, I think, is a big argument. And then
Yeah.
children are out there.
That's right.
So you're-
I did see that at the what's that? The vegetable market fair.
Farmers market.
Farmers market. I did see two security guards tell somebody to stop smoking, but I thought that was just because it was the city market. But it's a law. It's fascinating. Well, do they have is there a good case for that? Morally speaking? Do you see where the connect? This is what I want to get to the reading you had for today. Whether or not there's a moral case. Is it offending others? No, it seems to be harming somebody. Offense doesn't seem to be sufficient, and yet many argue that, to go back to your second papers, that offense is enough to preclude somebody from doing something. How we cash that out, of course, is important.
Well, it's also interesting because it brings up the fact with the legalization of marijuana and the laws that come with that, it sounds like smoking cigarettes in Santa Barbara is really similar to the laws that go with smoking marijuana, where it's you can't smoke it in public, it has to be on your own property.
Right.
Basically it's you can't do it in public, but those are two completely different drugs.
Yeah, but they're analogous too, sure.
Well, it's
One's legal and it's been legal for decades.
like alcohol. You can't drink in public. You can't walking around with beer.
Unless it's in a cordoned off area or
Yeah,
it's
unless it's in your backyard or
What's that?
your property. Same thing with a joint, I guess.
a joint.
Joint.
I don't know what that is. Joe? No. I believe it's pronounced joint. No, I'm kidding. So there you want to ask that question again. If there's no morally relevant difference, and here we're assuming some connection in the legal and moral some overlap. But if there is no morally relevant difference, well, then the two situations ought to be treated similarly, which will take us to Peter Singer's article, which I want to get to now. I just want to talk about a few of those things. We did talk about these before. It is in the reading you'll have for next time, in fact, looks at some of these issues. Is it next time? Yeah, the 30th. Nope, not the 30th. Excuse me. The 25th. Steven Pinker's The Moral Instinct. Steven Pinker and Peter Singer. I cannot get their names separate. They always overlap for me. We'll look at cases in which, Milo Yiannopoulos, the Westboro Baptist Church. These people are incredibly offensive to everyone. I think you know who the Westboro Baptist Church is. They go to funerals and yell at the people of the funerals, sometimes military funerals, because, what are their reasons? They have the freedom of speech to do this, but they're attacking, they're adamantly against homosexuality, and they argue that the United States, by allowing same-sex marriages and allowing gays in the military, the arguments go further than this, that the people who get killed in battle deserve it. And these are the things that they say. The worst possible things you could say at the worst possible time to the family members.
Wouldn't that be disorderly conduct?
No, because they're at a certain distance away, and they're not in the military themselves. So what do you mean by disorderly conduct?
Because disorderly conduct is disrupting the average or the natural peace of an environment.
Oh.
So if you're at a funeral, the natural environment of that is like everyone's, if you're shouting at that, it could be technically.
That's a good question. It depends. Well, I guess I have to look at the specific cases because they've been allowed to. They've not been precluded from yelling their position, from freely speaking it. But they do have to be a certain distance away, which may be related to your particular question, your particular point. So we'll return to these examples when we look at the Steven Pinker article. So this takes us to, I wanted to ground our discussion a little bit more with our basic understanding of arguments by analogy and how it applies to legal reasoning and especially moral reasoning. And the very fact that we can use the phrase moral reasoning, I think, tells us something. Because there's legal reasoning, there's reasoning about within different disciplines, biological reasoning, historical reasoning, scientific, mathematical reasoning. And if there is such reasoning, there are ways of doing it poorly. And if there are ways of reasoning poorly, doesn't that make some level of objectivity to it? Doesn't it lend itself to some criteria that we can say, this argument is superior to that argument, even though the subject matter is something that many people, when they first are introduced to moral reasoning, moral thinking, is presumed to be relative. It's all relative. It's up to the individual. Morality is simply a matter of pure opinion. It's a matter of taste. If that were the case, then moral reasoning wouldn't make much sense. It wouldn't make any more sense than saying, here's an argument for tastes with respect to how something tastes to you. Like hard-boiled eggs are disgusting to me, but I can't really make an argument to justify that. And you certainly couldn't make an argument against my claim that hard-boiled eggs are yucky, correct? You couldn't correct my view that they're disgusting to me. But it seems we can make better or worse arguments when it comes to moral thinking. So even if we are prone toward relativism, there still might be something we want to look at insofar as connecting what we've learned in this class to moral thinking. Yeah?
How is moral thinking not like subjective or like personal at all? Like how would, because even like your thoughts are influenced by like what you think is right and wrong and what your beliefs are. So then I don't think you're ever like what's the term? Like neutral. Like I don't think you ever have like a non-biased perspective in your morality sense.
Correct.
So
That's probably true. There's going to be biases. That's true.
then how can you like morally reason properly?
Well, if we extend that thought a bit further, and we do want to advocate for relativism, in particular moral relativism, but then we have to remember all the problems that come with moral relativism. It may be it just may be a fact that morality is as a matter of pure opinion as are tastes. What are the consequences of that? Do you recall a discussion of relativism when we looked at chapter 2? Obstacles to critical thinking, and relativism was one of them. So that was a long time ago. But what were some of the problems of accepting an extreme version of relativism? So and that doesn't necessarily mean morality is not a matter of opinion. It may be obvious to us that there aren't moral facts out there in the world that are in the way that there are physical facts. That may be just obvious to us. But does that mean that there aren't ways of reasoning that are better than others with respect to that content? Because, there are all sorts of things that we do reason about that are different than, let's say, something that's pure physical fact, a matter of objective, not a matter of opinion. It's either there or it isn't. And yet we can say, this viewpoint is superior to that one because of these grounds. Let's see if we can do that. Because maybe there aren't any ways of doing it. Maybe it is all indeed relative when it comes to morality. However, there's a principle, something called the is-ought fallacy, which is fine. I think it's a nice error, a nice label of an error. And according to this view, well, what do you get from that? The is-ought fallacy. Does that name tell you anything about what possible error is involved?
Is that like if
How so? Conditional, kind of. Yep.
Would that be like should be in fact, or you believe the law no matter if it's.
Oh, I see. I phrased it kind of like a disjunct, so like a false dilemma. Not quite that. That's kind of how I did that. That's my fault.
I guess it would be like if ought. So like, is something a certain way, then it ought to like
Be that way.
ought to
That's
be
exactly right. David Hume, many centuries ago, invoked this, or at least from his writing we get a sense of what this fallacy is, although I don't know that he would consider it an error in reasoning. But it's basically to say, you cannot go from a mere description of the way the world is, here's how it is, and then jump to, and therefore it ought to be this way. So assuming that because something is now the practice, therefore it ought to be the practice. Or you can go the other direction too.
Is that a hasty generalization? Or jumping to?
It may be jumping to a conclusion, but it's not clearly a hasty generalization. Unless you phrase, go ahead.
Not like something specific to a general whole.
Well, because oftentimes you're saying this is, I guess it could be that. You can say, here's a particular case, this is how it is, therefore it should be, and every case similar to that one should be this way. So sure, I guess if you could formulate in terms of a hasty generalization.
Like an argument from tradition or something like that?
Yes, that's another variation of it. This is the way it's always been, therefore it should be this way. So an argument by tradition might be similar to that. It's giving a description and saying that's enough, as if we can get a moral prescription just from sort of giving physical facts or giving a detailed descriptive fact of the way the world is. Can you come up with a counterexample to that, showing that you can't just get morality out of pure description? You're missing something there. You're missing a moral principle. What would be an example where a description doesn't give us morality?
I mean, like Jim Crow laws?
That would be one. So here, it's the law, therefore it's as it should be, right? Or the laws accepting slavery. Those would be other examples of that. So those, just because something is a particular way or is practiced a particular way, doesn't mean it should continue to be that way. I don't know if these examples are satisfactory. The Electoral College is clearly supporting the Constitution, so leave it be. That's a kind of variation of this is-ought fallacy, which you can extend on this. Women have been harassed for as long as men and women have been working together. This sounds like an exaggerated position, but sadly it's not. It's an argument that's been used before, in particular with the argument against allowing women into the military or into the front lines. And there's another one. Why argue about whether abortion is moral? It is legal, so what's the issue? Again, these are a bit of exaggerated ways of putting it, and yet there are arguments similar to this. Question?
Does this at all coincide with moral theories like utilitarianism and I guess moral relativism through the perspective of like what drives pleasure or pain, deciding things, is there ought to be based on self-interest?
So, in response to this as being a fallacy, you might say, is this where you're going? That if the pleasure principle or something like that is what drives us, and it is a fact that humans desire pleasure and want to avoid pain, then it ought to be the case that we have laws or morals based upon that. And so utilitarianism, or one version of it, like Jeremy Bentham, exactly, would have a view similar to that, that we ought to do that which will accumulate or amass or maximize the greatest amount of pleasures. And he's even got a little calculus for that, a little hedonic calculus. Well, is it fecund? What's the fecundity of it and the propinquity of it? These are words that sadly nobody uses anymore. But does it give rise to greater pleasures? And can you measure those pleasures? And it seems there he's going, here's a description of the world, and I'm jumping to a prescription of it. If this is the way the world is, then this is how our actions should be. And there's an interesting argument to be made there. And if you look at contemporary ethicists, well, he's an ethicist, is it Joshua Green, who engages in something called experimental philosophy, where he says, look, we need to learn from neuroscience and neuropsychology and so forth about facts, descriptions about the way we are, And that may tell us something that may inform us about our moral ideas. I think, however, he will not go so far as to say, giving us scientific facts will give us the morals. I think his main point is, we cannot figure out what is right and wrong without having some basis in a descriptive worldview, which is not quite the same thing as saying there is no error in reasoning with is-ought. So I think, I don't know what Bentham would say about this. Is Bentham violating this? Is he guilty of this fallacy? Or would we rather say it's not even a fallacy at all?
I just feel like when you apply moral theories like that to fallacies or any sort of fallacy, it kind of tells that there's always going to be some level of discourse when discussing moral.
And there should be. And once you've admitted that there's going to be discourse, you bring with it all the other rules of discourse communication, and in particular, argumentation. And once you've joined that discussion, you've already admitted, to an extent, this is where we saw the logical problems of relativism, that there are rules of the game, and that there are criteria, as H.P. Grice would call it, the logic of conversation. There are particular rules. There are rules of argumentation as well. And in a way, the problem with extreme relativism is that it gives up the rules of the game. And at the same time wants to play, but not by any of the rules. Like my son playing chess by the rules of checkers. It's like you're cheating. Do you want to play the game? Yes. Well, you have to go by, there are set rules, right? Okay, so let's see. Then let me go through another one. We have until, how much time do we need for the thing? Like 5 minutes for the...
5, 6.
Six, okay, we'll give it 6 minutes. All right, so we have about, what's that? 5.5. All right, we'll give it 5.5. So 5.5 minutes till we end. Stop me before then. Another error related to that's most commonly found with moral reasoning. In fact, I saw a pamphlet. I picked it up. Where did it go? From Earth Day. Compassionate choices. If you care about animals, please consider not eating them. Just fantastic sentence. Just consider it. It's not saying, don't eat them. Just consider it. If you care about them, think about not eating them. Right? Anyway, that's why is that related to how is that connected, do you think? What the naturalistic fallacy, which says basically, claims that derive ethical conclusions from natural facts. You see, this is similar to the is-ought fallacy, but it's a little bit different when you look at what we conclude from it. To put it in the simplest terms, it is good because it is natural. Why is Whole Foods so popular? Because it's natural food. And all things natural are good. And again, all you're doing here, we need to look for a counterexample to that.
So is that kind of like saying marijuana is good because it's a natural
Yeah,
plant?
it's natural. It's hemp. It grows or whatever. I mean, it's naturally occurring. Can you think of other naturally occurring things that aren't necessarily good just by virtue of... You see a similarity to this. What is it?
Opioids.
Opioids. Yes. Yeah, that's one.
Hemlock?
Hemlock? Is that naturally? I think it is. Yeah?
Hurricanes?
Hurricanes are natural. I guess, yeah. Unless humans have a role to play in that. Do humans cause hurricanes? We cause earthquakes. When I lived in Illinois, there were in neighboring states, they had a lot of fracking, as it's called, which they drill for oil, like they just explode water down there, and I don't know how it works. And that causes small earthquakes. It actually increases the number of earthquakes. And so that's human, I guess, done endeavors. But of course, earthquakes and hurricanes happened before humans came along. So it seems obvious. And also there are things that are unnatural, but that are not bad in the moral sense, such as what? Cheetos? Those would never happen in nature. And they're good. No, they're not.
Definitely not good for you.
They're not morally good. They're not healthy, but they taste good. That goes back to the ambiguity of. But they're not immoral, right? Unless they're a really big bag and you're buying at a convenience store in New York. It's too big of a bag. You can't have it.
So how is that relative to the brochure that you got?
Oh, good question. Yeah, I forgot I asked that. Thank you.
What?
You have to answer that. How is this fallacy employed, do you think, on occasion when it comes to eating animals? Was it 95% of people eat animals in the United States? Maybe it says that here.
If we didn't eat meat once a week, meat or cheese, we would, like, it would take off, like, some million numbers of carbs equal not gravity.
Oh, so that's a positive for it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, yes, I believe that might be true.
Really shouldn't be eating.
How would somebody be guilty of the naturalistic fallacy with respect to the animals? Do I have an example? Oh, Devin, I do. Just hold off on that.
I think it's a better argument to say, like, agriculture is harmful in our environment, rather than, I don't like the argument of eating animals is bad because they have feelings, because they're living. Because then my argument is, well, who are you to say that plants don't have feelings?
In the brain.
Ah, good. Now we get to the argument by analogy. How similar are plants that are living and a pig that's living? We can go to Aristotle here. They both live, they need nutrition. They both survive with sunlight and soil and so forth. Plants can't really move. I guess there's some that move toward the sun. What's a relevant dissimilarity between a plant and a pig, for example?
Central nervous system.
Eyeballs? Yeah.
Brain, essential nervous system.
The ability to harvest plants like in a sustainable way and like they continue to grow and like you can keep replanting them and like keeping that ecosystem going
You get pigs
while
together.
still surviving off of them. But if you kill an animal, the animal's dead and then it's gone and then all of the animal populations are thrown off and that throws off the ecosystem more than just eating off plants. There we go. I
What
don't
if you
know.
reproduce?
I don't know if that lines up 100%, but that's
What
just.
about if you reproduce, like, you have two parents, two
Then you're
pig
just
parents?
raising animals to kill them, and that's kind of cruel.
Aren't you just raising plants to kill them?
Well, no, because you're only,
If you
okay, yeah, a
do
little
it-
bit.
Let's see.
conceded that point.
I'm for not eating against meat, but I just don't like that argument. I like the argument of like
No.
more so that it's for the environment. I think a lot more people will jump on board with that.
Right, and I think that pamphlet talks about that. But you do want to look at the dissimilarities between a plant and an animal, because animals have similar systems that humans do, but plants don't have those. And it may be the case that just by virtue of being alive isn't sufficient to say that it's capable of feeling. That might be a point where the discussion would continue, and we would look at whether or not that's a relevant dissimilarity or irrelevant. Here would be the example of it, I think I was trying to get to. Why would it not be moral to eat animals? Look at our teeth. You got these fangs. They're designed to... Humans have been eating animals since the beginning of time.
That's such a fallacy.
Yeah, that's just false.
Good. I want you to never say that ever. That's why I have it that way. Never, ever. I've said it before, I know probably redundantly, but that should never be in any of your papers, unless you're going to say...
The time is a construct of human consciousness.
Oh, no, I meant this. Don't say since the beginning of time, unless, so you're talking about stardust. I don't know. I don't know when you would say that's accurate. Usually it's not. But why is it relevant that we have teeth that are capable of tearing into... Let me use a rhetorical ploy here. Huh? In the last class, I gave an example of a pig. When I was in San Diego, I saw... Did I tell you about this, the pig? Was it this class I talked about a pig? This guy was walking a pig? And it was a pet pig, obviously. And it was like a couple weeks before that, in San Diego, a guy had gone to jail. He got a 3-year sentence for setting a dog on fire. I'm not sure what to... It's all right. So, I don't know what the... Maybe that wasn't a long enough sentence. Maybe it should have been longer, 3 years. But what came to mind, and this has to do with analogy and morals and also, and all that we're talking about here, and it briefly passed by, very briefly, I thought to myself, if I walked over to that pet pig and kicked it in the ribs, I could go to jail. But if I owned a pig farm, I can raise that pig in a tiny pen, treat it horribly its whole life, then kill it and eat it and have that whole thing subsidized by the... This thought all went very quickly through my head. And by the way, I had really no intention of kicking the pig. This was just a thought experiment. And my question related to that is, what is the morally relevant difference between that pet pig, and I call it a pet pig, is that relevant? Or does it just push the question back? What's the morally relevant difference between a pet and animals that we eat? And if we just say, well, there are pets, they're different, you see how that pushes the question further. What makes something a pet, and therefore not open to being consumed? Yeah.
Well, that's why, you know how in China they have a festival where they eat dogs?
Yes?
And they get a lot of judgment from the US saying to like basically like stop. But
Yeah.
trying to kind of like step off what's the difference between
That's right.
your cows and our dogs.
Yeah. Are cows less cute? Are cows more tasty? Are those relevant moral or legal factors?
They're more social.
Ah, dogs are more social than cows?
Well, pigs have been produced.
Let's assume it's true. Is it a morally relevant difference? Because we could reason further, this infant is not especially social, and this pig is really social. Well, you don't have to go quite that far. Did you have... So, what did I say? We have a couple more minutes. I'm not actually going to get to... Am I? No, I've got... Well, there's a couple of other examples, and I'll just give you this last argument. So we can say, similar to with the other examples of naturalistic fallacy, aggression is rampant in nature. It's totally natural. Try to squash your natural tendency toward aggression is wrong. Disease in nature happens all the time. It is part of nature. Why would you... I mean, those seem to be absurd cases. But again, what you're doing primarily in moral arguments, what you do so often, is look at a case that you know something about. And that's what Peter Singer is doing in trying to, and again, make the case without falling prey to any of these fallacies. And your job is to establish whether he does this, is to start with a case where it's obvious to us, and then show us that it's analogous to the questionable case. And in his case, the argument is this, on page 2 of the reading. Premise 1, if we can prevent something bad without sacrificing anything of comparable significance, we ought to do it. This is what you wrote on last time. And I think I have everyone's papers back. There's one more up there that we can get back yet. Second premise, extreme poverty is bad. That's undeniable, I think. Premise 3, there is some extreme poverty that we can prevent without sacrificing anything of comparable moral significance. Do you remember what that means? Conclusion, therefore, we ought to prevent some extreme poverty. What he's doing is taking that argument and saying we ought to give up something. All of us ought to give, and it's not even that much, he says. We're not giving up a whole lot, and certainly not sacrificing anything of comparable moral significance, in the sense that we can save lives by giving money, as he's talking about, to certain charitable organizations. Failing to do so, he says, is analogous to failing to stop a child from drowning right in front of you. Here's the example he starts with. Suppose that on my way to give a lecture, I pass a shallow ornamental pond. I notice that a small child has fallen in and is in danger of drowning. Would anyone deny that I ought to wade in and pull the child out? This will mean muddying my clothes, ruining my shoes, and either canceling my lecture or delaying it until I can find something dry to change into. But compared with the avoidable death of the child, none of these things seem significant. Next time we'll look at what we've looked at thus far with respect to arguments by analogy and many of the fallacies we looked at, and see whether or not Singer's argument is a strong argument by analogy. Hold on, don't leave.